When McCall and I got engaged, there were various things that we had to get done to get ready for the wedding. If you've been through that process, you know there's a ton of stuff you have to get done for the wedding. One of these goals, one of these things we had to do was complete the wedding registry. Now, when I got engaged and we were starting to start talking about the registry process, I had several married friends of mine tell me that I shouldn't get too involved with the wedding registry process. Kind of leave it to McCall. She has a certain way she's going to want the house to look like. There's going to be a lot of stuff you're not really going to care about, so just don't deal with it because it's just going to save you from a lot of arguments and frustrations with each other. And being the thoughtful, understanding, teachable person I am, I said no. I am not going to do that. I'm going to be involved with this wedding registry process every step of the way. And it didn't take very long for me to realize that that was a big mistake. I should have listened to my friend's advice. Because the first thing that we started trying to figure out to put on the registry was dinner plates. And we spent hours and hours and hours looking at all sorts of different dinner plates to get on this stupid wedding registry, and we couldn't agree on what we wanted because I was too stubborn to just submit to her wishes, and so she liked some and I liked some, and it just didn't work out that way. So we spent hours looking at these just different plates. And finally, we landed on one, and we started working throughout the rest of the kitchen appliances and items and stuff. And then we finally got to deal with putting a butter boat on the registry. Now, I grew up in a household that did not have real butter. We had a fake tub of butter in our fridge that we'd pull out and get a knife and just start spreading it on stuff. But McCall's family, they had real butter where they used a stick of butter, and they had a butter boat that would be brought into the center of the table, and you could take the butter and use it however you wanted. And so we started looking at different butter boats because we decided that we wanted to follow that pattern. And we finally found one that we just loved. It matched everything else that we had. It looked good. It was ready to go. So we added it to the cart. And then McCall says this. She says, "Oh, wait, we need a second one." Now, I should have known better, but I just couldn't help myself. And you know, it didn't matter to me whether we put 1 or 2 or 5 butter dishes on our wedding registry, but there was something that McCall said that just bugged me and bothered me. And so I said to her, now hold on. I don't care how many we put on, but let's just set the record straight. We do not need 2 butter boats. We only need 1. The second one's just a bonus. Well, what proceeded was 10 minutes of me getting a learning experience on why it was so necessary to have 2 butter boats in the household, where you need to have one ready in stock to bring in whenever another one gets dirty or empty. That way you have butter on hand all the time at any chance. We ended up putting 2 butter boats on our wedding registry. Skip ahead 5 years, and I gotta say, it's pretty nice to have 2 butter boats in our house. It's kind of funny, though, to think about when we think about different wants and needs in life, isn't it? Sometimes we get that mixed up. Sometimes the things that we feel we need are simply things that we want. And at other times, the things that we need play second fiddle to the things that we want. Sometimes we get that mixed up in our life. Sometimes not. Sometimes, many times, we have serious unmet needs in our life. There are people in our community that have serious financial, physical, unmet needs. In fact, me just saying that may draw to mind a face or a name that you're thinking about, someone that you know in your life that has serious needs that are not being met. On the other hand, some of you might be the person who is in need. You have some unmet physical or unmet financial need that you need some help with. In our life, there are serious needs that people have to deal with and are trying to figure out. And then we, the church, have to make sense of this. When we see unmet needs in people's life, what should we as individuals do? What should we as a church do when we see physical and financial needs of people in our community? I think what we can do to help us answer that question is see the pattern of the early church. In the early church, we get a sense of what was important and what the church did. It was a similar dynamic to our life, where there are some people who are really well off, that were more on the wealthy end of the side of the church life, while there was other people in the church who were in poor and impoverished situations. They were in deep need. And what we see in the church is how they met the needs. And they met it through generosity. We are in a current sermon series called Brickmaster, where we've been building this wall, a wall that represents us building a firm and strong faith, where we are committing ourselves to practicing different types of consistency to build that strong faith. Last week, we looked at consistent presence, what it looks like to be prioritizing church presence in your life, and the beautiful need for that. This week, I would like us to consider what it looks like to have a consistent generosity. Because that's the pattern of the early church. The early church had a desire to be generous in the lives of others. We see an expectation that God's people are called to be generous people. But why? Like why is it so important for us to be generous consistently? Why should we be generous to those who have little? Well, I think if we examine the early church's posture a little bit closely, it may give us some wisdom on what to do. We get different summary descriptions of this church, and one of these highlights what the church did when they saw needs in their community. And I think it might help us out. The church, this summary description written by Luke, he says something that is important that we will start with, and he says something along these lines that the church was spiritually unified. It was not people that just met together for the sake of meeting together, but there was a deep bond, a commitment, a oneness with each other. If you want to see this description for yourself, just join me in the book of Acts this morning. We'll be in Acts chapter 4. If you don't know your Bible, we're in the New Testament. It goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. We'll be in Acts chapter 4. If you have a digital Bible, that's fine too. If you want to follow along, it'll be the CSB translation. If you don't have either of those options or you don't want to, we also have the words on the screen. In Acts 4, verse 32, listen to what Luke writes here. He says this: "Now the entire group of those who believed were of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but instead they held everything in common." Luke tells us that this early church was unified to their core, that they were of one heart and one mind. Now that phrase does not seem super important to us at first, but when you look at Scripture and you examine Scripture, you'll see that phrase comes up time and time again. And in the Old Testament, it describes a certain context. For someone to be called of one heart and one mind describes commitment to God. Someone who is of one heart and one mind is someone who is totally devoted to loving God and giving worship to Him. So what Luke is telling us about the early church is that they are of one heart and one mind, that they were spiritually unified, that they were totally committed, they were completely devoted to giving worship and love to God, that they decided to live out the mission that God had set for them. This early church, they were not people that met together for the sake of meeting together. Instead, it was their commitment to God and their commitment to God's mission that brought them together and unified them and kept them unified. That they were so unified that it caused them to be selfless with everything they had. That their possessions were not just their own, that they were a community that shared everything with everyone. And friends, I think in this brief description of the church, there's a reminder for us, something that we need to keep in touch with at Southern Heights. We may have all sorts of dreams and aspirations here. We may expect God to do big things here at Southern Heights. We may even have the means and the numbers to make those big things happen. But nothing can happen unless the church is unified. We cannot expect to do big things and do great things for God and God's kingdom if we can't be unified on the basic, most fundamental level, if we aren't of one heart and one mind. On the flip side of that, if we can truly pursue that, if we can maintain unity, if we can be of one heart, one mind, completely devoted to God's ways and God's people, then the possibilities are endless. because we are able to pool our time, treasure, and talent in a way that can make a big impact. But it starts with us being unified, to be of one heart and one mind. And that's what the early church did. They were completely and spiritually unified with each other. They were spiritually unified because at their core was something that kept them together. At their core, in everything they did, was the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus first unified them, but the resurrection of Jesus also was their center focus on everything they did. That they felt called to be witnesses to Jesus rising from the dead, to share with the world the kingly reign of Jesus. Take a look at what Luke describes here in the next verse. He says this in verse 33. With great power, the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was on all of them. As the church goes out, he describes the apostles, which are our early church leaders. They are going out and they are proclaiming, they are giving testimony to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, when we think of testimony and church culture and church speak, we're often talking about this story about how someone goes from being away from God and how they have this come to Jesus moment and they become a Christian. But when we think about testimony in the Bible, it's a much broader category. It's describing someone who is being a witness towards something. It's something that is more than just words. It describes actions and character and full body experience. What Luke is implying here is that the early church and the leaders of the early church were being great witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Not just in their words, but in everything they did. Everything they did pointed to Jesus rising from the dead. And as a result of that, great grace was placed on the early church. That word is describing favor, that God's favor rested on the church, that God approved of the way that they were acting as a community because they were exactly as God expected them to be. They were fulfilling God's ideal picture of what his people should be. And throughout the whole church's life and experience, they pointed back to Jesus over and over and over again about his resurrection. That's what it means to be missional. They felt a missional responsibility to be witnesses to what Jesus did. They felt a missional responsibility. They kept pointing back to the resurrection because they felt that it was an earth-shattering, life-changing, transformative moment. That Jesus lived, he died, he was buried. 3 days later, he rose from the grave, and he reigned as Lord and King over all things. And as Lord, as the resurrected King, he brought a new, transformed reality to all people. The resurrection is at the core of this church. That it promoted and produced everything that they did. And for us, friends, as we think about how it looks like for us to interact and be as a church, I think that's important. That at our center, at our core, should be the resurrection of Jesus. The reason we meet, the things we say, what we do, how we act, how we interact with the world should all be sourced, that it should be an outflowing of Jesus rising from the dead. That we believe that Jesus genuinely died, but he genuinely, bodily rose back to life. And as a result, our resurrected King brings a new, transformed reality, and it changes everything. And as a result, we should be witnesses to that. That everything we do should point back to Jesus rising from the dead, that his resurrection changes everything for the world, for us, for people in their life. And so the church did that. They acted as witnesses. And one of the ways they witnessed, they acted not just in words, but in actions, was in caring for the needs of people. There were unmet needs in the community, and they didn't just pass them by, but instead they met those needs with radical generosity. That they believed that the resurrection of Jesus changes everything, and they were going to show that change by changing people's lives. Take a look at what happens next. This is one of the most radical, one of the most beautiful, one of the most fascinating two verses of the description of the new church, of the first church. It's so beautiful. Take a look at what they do. And remember, this is all as a result of the resurrection. For there was not a needy person among them, because all those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the proceeds of what was sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet. This was then distributed to each person as any had need. The basic pattern we have here of generosity is that people, the wealthy side of the church, sold their property and possessions and land, their homes, collected the money, pooled it together with the church, and then they entrusted the church leaders to distribute the funds when needed to those who had needs in the community. It's a beautiful picture, a radical picture of generosity, because they knew something. They believed at their core that the resurrection of Jesus changes everything. That in rising from the dead, Jesus brings, as king, a new reality, an ideal reality, a better reality for the world, a reality where everyone is brought to a level playing field in status and value, a reality where everybody's needs in the community are met. And so as a result, this church felt a missional responsibility to share that transformative power with people. And one of the ways they did that was through radical generosity. I mean, look at what is happening here. Left and right, people are selling homes, selling land, doing these things that the people looking in would say this is a financially stupid decision. It makes no sense whatsoever. It doesn't bring you any honor. It doesn't build you up. It's taking all this money that is yours and bringing it in to help others. It makes no sense, and yet that's the picture that the church did, that people were radically generous in the early church because they felt a missional responsibility to help those in need, that it was part of what it meant to be the people of God. And so the wealthy in the church used their funds to raise up the poor and impoverished in the church. They brought everyone on an equal playing field. They said no one is left behind in God's community. The church was radically generous as a result of feeling missionally responsible. In fact, we could describe it in this way. There's a sort of pattern here that we see with the church, a description of the church that looks kind of like this on the screen, that the resurrection of Jesus formed the church. As a result of Jesus rising from the dead, it created a new unified community. This church, the community, saw unmet needs within their people, within their groups, needs of people in poverty. And then they felt, in seeing those needs, they felt a missional responsibility. That this is something that they had an obligation to do something about. And when feeling that missional responsibility, that then resulted in them taking radical action to meet those needs, to care for the least of these, to take care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. They resulted, in this case, in radical generosity. They felt this because they felt the resurrection changes everything. They did this because they realized that this is a marker of what it means to be God's people. And a new community that equals a level playing field, that meets needs. And I think when we look at this passage, we hear a message that's so important for all churches today, for us today, that a generous church is a genuine church. That a marker of what it means to be God's people is caring for the least of these, meeting the needs that are being unmet in the community. Maybe to help you and I understand that, let's bring it a little bit more closer to home. Here at Southern Heights, our mission is to love God, love people, and share Jesus. That we expect everything we do to flow out of that mission, that every action we take, every step we do, every event we hold, every teaching we have should be an outpouring of loving God, loving people, and sharing Jesus. And we do that in a number of different ways, but one way that we can pursue that mission is through radical generosity as individuals and as a church. Because when we are radically generous, we are loving God. We're loving God because we're taking care of the people in His community. We're loving God because we are being the community that He's made us to be, that He's expected us to be. But when we're radically generous, we're also loving people because we are caring for the needs and the least of these. We are taking care of those who can't care for themselves. We are showing love to them instead of selfishly harboring funds and resources for our own personal gain. We decide to selflessly look after others. We are loving people. But third, when we are radically generous, when we take care of the least of these, when the leaders at Southern Heights decide to take care and look after those who can't care for themselves and take steps to be generous, we're really sharing Jesus. We're sharing with people, with those individuals, the love of Jesus. We're sharing with them this new, transformed reality that the resurrection of our King brings. So when we are radically generous, we can love God, we can love people, and we can certainly share Jesus. A generous church is a genuine church. And so if you are at Southern Heights, if you call this church your home, if you are a member here at SHCC, you have an obligation, you have a missional responsibility to care for and look after the needs of others within our community. You have a responsibility to care for the least of these. And one of the ways you can do that, not the only way, but one of the ways you can do that is following that pattern of the early church, where they were financially generous, they pooled their money together as a church, and then they entrusted the leadership to use those funds and disperse those funds to those who were in deep financial or physical need. Now, understand, this is a sliding scale. It's not the same for everyone. For those who are poor and impoverished here, there's not an expectation to be as radically generous as those who are wealthy. As you get more wealthy, there's a higher expectation, a higher responsibility to look after those who are impoverished. So if you're on this side of the economic scale, you have a higher obligation to be radically generous for the sake of lifting up the others, to balance the scales, to meet the needs, just as Jesus expects in his community. Because a generous church is a genuine church. On the flip side of that, if you are a leader here at Southern Heights, if you are an elder here, you have a responsibility. You have a missional obligation to use the funds Southern Heights has and manage it wisely. Not to just store it up for a rainy day like some churches do. Not to just use it to build our church up to make it bigger and better than any other church in the community. But instead, we are to use it in part to help meet the needs of those who can't meet the needs for themselves. To take steps to be generous to those who need generosity given to them. To show the resurrection of Jesus changes everything and builds a new community. And imagine what could happen if we did that. Imagine the possibilities of each of us set out to be consistently, radically generous. What if we met the needs of those who can't meet the needs for themselves? What if we cared for the least of these, both as individuals and as a church? The possibilities would be endless. Amazing things would happen. The witness to the resurrection would truly take place. People would surely see Jesus for who he is. There's a story that I read about, a news article I read about a couple weeks ago that has just been stuck in my head since I've read it. I can't get it out of my mind. I'd like to share it with you. There's a church named Hope City Church that has two campuses, one in Joplin, Missouri, and one in Fayetteville, Arkansas. This church noticed this last year a deep need in the community, that medical debt was financially ruining people. It was causing deep poverty for those that could not afford to keep up with the bills, to keep up with the expenses. They saw people within their own church struggle with medical debt that was causing them to sell so much in their homes. Some people had to sell their homes and downsize. They had to keep doing things to keep up with this debt. It was destroying families. And so one day, the church leaders got together and they said, we need to do something about this. We feel a missional responsibility to show the transformative nature of Jesus. And so what they did is they asked the question, what can we tangibly do to make an impact on the lives of these families. So here's what they decided to do. They decided to take a radical step where they brought in donations and they set aside a portion of the church budget to pool together $25,000 to help cover the financial debts of people. But they didn't stop there, because they partnered with a Christian nonprofit organization called Undo Medical Debt that works to barter with debts to cover the debts at lower prices. And so the church worked with this organization, and by the end of the year, that $25,000 donated to it, partnered with Undo Medical Debt, led to $4.2 million of medical debt being erased for 3,200 people in their community. And then after that happened, they wrote a letter to each of these families saying, your debt has been abolished. And I love whenever the church pastor said, as he was announcing this to the church, what happened, the amazing work that had taken place. He said this, it's stuck with me. I can't think of a better example and picture of grace and the love of Jesus than that letter, and who might receive that this Christmas, knowing that they have been praying, trying to figure out what this looks like in my life. The church, gathered as due to the resurrected Jesus, saw an unmet need in the community, felt a missional responsibility to show the witness of Jesus, and then took radical action to meet those needs. A generous church is a genuine church. And so don't miss that opportunity, friends. Don't miss the opportunity to love God, love people, and share Jesus. Don't miss the chance to be radically generous, because you never know what will happen. You'll never know who will see Jesus for the first time in their life. During this sermon series, we're continuing to have a special response time at the end of each service where we're building up this wall of faith as we continue to strengthen what a consistent faith looks like. And we have this response each week that if you are feeling convicted or called to pursue an aspect of consistency in your life, we encourage you to come up here, write that item on one of these bricks, and place it on the wall as a way to say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to build my faith through this. This week, for some of you, you need to write radical generosity. For some of you, it might be something else. And so during this next song, feel free to come up and write on one of these bricks and put it on this wall. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can come after service and do it as well. We also have these prayer benches up front, and we also have elders that will be out in the back, that if you feel called to pray with one of them or pray with yourself, you can do that during this next song.